Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This lecture is intended for students enrolled in the Academy's Classical Rhetoric course. If you're not enrolled in the course and would like to join us for self-paced studies, visit classicalliberalarts.com. My name is William Michael. I'm the Academy Headmaster, and I'll be leading this study of Chapter 2 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric. I want to say up front that this study, Chapter 2 in Book 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric, is a very difficult study. This lecture will be lengthy, as I will go through all of the content of the chapter. It's not going to be easy, but the benefit of these recorded lectures is that students can take their time, listen to them, take notes, rewind them, listen to them again. Just take your time and work through the content of the lesson. It's very difficult, so don't be discouraged. Just work little by little, and eventually you'll get through this, and then you'll look back and say, I can't imagine when I thought that this was going to be difficult or even impossible. We can get through this, and my goal in this lecture is to help you to do so. This work, just to review, was written by Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BC, probably composed around 350 BC. So let's use that as our date for this work, 350 BC, 350 years before Christ. The purpose of this chapter in this book is to really serve as the foundational definition of rhetoric itself. And this chapter establishes the three modes of persuasion, which are very important for the study of the art of rhetoric. This art of rhetoric is worth our study as Catholic students because it has been profoundly influential in Catholic history, particularly in the work of Thomas Aquinas, who integrated these Aristotelian principles of reasoning into the moral theology of the Catholic Church and recognized rhetoric as a legitimate art when ordered toward truth and the common good. So with St. Thomas as our model, let's get started with this work. Now, I've read this chapter and made a reading of it, a recorded reading of it, available separately because it's lengthy. So I didn't want to include that in this lecture. But if you would like to listen to my reading of it, that recording is available. Otherwise, you should take a break here and read the chapter for yourself before going further. Before I go any further, I'd like to take a moment and pray to commit this study to the Lord and ask for his blessing. Let us pray. Lord our God, in your wisdom and love, you surround us with the mysteries of the universe. Send your Spirit upon us and fill us with your wisdom and blessings, and grant that we may devote ourselves to our studies and draw ever closer to you, the source of all knowledge. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Again, as I mentioned before, I've read this chapter and published a recorded reading of it separately, so I'm not going to do that in this lecture. As far as the division of this chapter, it is a lengthy chapter, and the division is quite complex. Fortunately, if you read the text on the Academy website, the division is already written out. You can see the sections or the parts of the chapter labeled. There are a total of 14 divisions given to the text, and these divisions are arbitrary. I've made these divisions based on the content as I judge best. You could disagree about the division. It's not anything official. Aristotle certainly didn't give us this division, but it's just intended to help order and guide our study. So in this second chapter, the first part, if you'd like to mark this in your own text if you're studying another text. This is Thomas Taylor's translation, but the beginning, part one, provides us with a definition and a scope for the art of rhetoric that begins at the top of the chapter and continues until a second part begins, where we read, with respect, however, to things which procure credibility. That second part identifies for us the sources of credibility. The third part, which I would say is the most important part of this lesson, is beginning at of the credibility, however. And in that section, Aristotle presents to us the three modes of persuasion, very, very important. The fourth part begins at since, however, credibility is effected. And in that part, Aristotle discusses rhetoric's relationship to other arts. The fifth part begins with respect, however, to proof, either real or apparent. There, Aristotle describes or discusses the rhetorical and dialectical methods, how they relate. Part 6 begins at but what the difference is. And in that sixth part, Aristotle discusses the distinction between example and enthymeme, which relate to two different kinds of reasoning. Part 7 begins at now, however, and Aristotle talks about the relative nature of persuasion, that it relates to the audience. Part 8 begins at the employment, however, of rhetoric. Aristotle talks here about the proper domain, the proper place of the art of rhetoric. Part 9, we read, there are, however, a few necessary things, and he then discusses the contingent nature of rhetoric, and we'll talk about that in the interpretation together. Part 10 begins at this being the case, and there Aristotle discusses enthymemes, probabilities, and signs. Part 11, he goes into the classification of signs. He says, but with respect to signs, marks that 11th section. Part 12, he talks about examples of different types of signs. He says, with respect to signs, however. Part 12. Part 13, we have a summary and the nature of example. He says, we have therefore now shown. And then lastly, we have the example of Dionysius and the conclusion to the chapter. So 14 parts into which we can divide this text. And remember, the goal of the study is to understand every sentence in the text. Every sentence represents a distinct idea. The goal is to study to understand every sentence in the text. That's what we're going to work on now as we move to the interpretation or exposition of the text. My goal is to try and explain as much of this content as possible. And as I said, I want to make sure you're aware that I'm aware that this is a very difficult chapter. So if you read through it on your own and just said, I have no idea what this is talking about, there's a lot of confusing language, some new vocabulary, and we'll unpack all of that as we go through the text together here. So let's get started. We read at the beginning, Aristotle says, now therefore we shall endeavor to speak concerning the method itself, that is, the rhetorical art, and show how and from what particulars we may be able to obtain the end proposed by this art. So having established the goal for this study, the reason for this study in chapter 1, Aristotle is rolling up his sleeves and saying, all right, let's get to work. He begins by announcing his intention to explain this method of rhetoric, which he himself discovered and developed in a systematic way. The word method here, he says, we shall endeavor to speak concerning the method. The word method means a systematic way of pursuing the knowledge of a subject, a systematic way, a method. He's got a certain method. And this is important because it shows that rhetoric, as he said in chapter 1, is not just a collection of tricks. It's not just a natural ability. It's not just a gift or a talent that certain people had. There is a method to this art of persuasiveness. It's a genuine art with principles that we can learn and then apply in all different ways, in all different areas of life, in our own unique circumstances, and so on. That's what makes the art so important. When he speaks about the end proposed by this art, the end proposed by this art, as he said at the end of chapter 1, refers to persuasion. That's the goal, toward which all of this rhetorical activity is directed. Remember, he said the goal of rhetoric is not actually the persuasion of the audience, but the ability to understand or recognize all of the available means of persuasion that we have access to on any given topic. So that's the goal. Persuasiveness, I think, is better than persuasion as a word to represent the goal for this study. And what's important is that this reflects this Aristotelian idea that every art has a certain end. That's why there are so many arts, because there are different necessary ends. And that purpose defines the nature of the art itself. So when we understand that persuasiveness is the goal or the end of rhetoric, that directs our pursuit of this art, because it helps us to understand what we're trying to obtain. We're trying to obtain this virtue of persuasiveness by the study and practice of this art. He goes on to say, again, therefore, as if defining from the beginning, let's discuss what remains. Let rhetoric then be, and here is his definition of rhetoric, very important. Let rhetoric be the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion. Notice that the end of rhetoric is in us, that is, the student of rhetoric, not in the audience. He says, let rhetoric be the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion. Very, very important line, which we'll be sure to memorize in this lesson. Aristotle provides this definition. Now, in that definition, he uses the word power. Let rhetoric be the power. Aristotle, as he explained in chapter 1, again, he believes that this persuasive, or I should say perception of what is persuasive, is something that's natural to man. It's a power or a faculty like reason itself. Aristotle believes that rhetoric is a capacity or ability that can be developed, like our muscles. I always use muscles as an example. We're all born with muscles, but muscles don't do what they're supposed to do by themselves. We can train them. We can study to use them, take care of them, eat healthy, and so on. And we can actually bring the capacity of our muscles to perfection. Aristotle believes that this persuasiveness is a power that's born in us, that's created in us, but it's something that we've got to collaborate with, to work with, in order to make it as fruitful as possible. And this is very important in Aristotle's understanding of the arts. He believes that through these arts, we're basically perfecting human nature. We're making the most of the natural powers that God has given us. And we can apply this skill, this perfection of this power to all different circumstances in our life. He uses the word perceiving in this definition, the power of perceiving. And perceiving means to know something. Usually when we use the word perceive, we use it with respect to the senses, like perception is knowledge acquired through the senses. But it's a knowledge, a power of knowing in everything what is capable in that subject, for example. In that subject, what is capable of producing persuasion. And in chapter 1, in the first lesson, I talked about um, Sherlock Holmes being a good example of one who has really developed and perfected, even though he's a fictional character, one who has developed this power of perception of what is persuasive in any situation. He says, in everything, perceiving in everything. And that, again, goes back to the opening chapter where he emphasized one of his reasons for the study of rhetoric was that it's useful for everyone. It applies to every situation. And this skill, once developed, allows us to perceive in any situation, in any subject, what may be persuasive. So it's a universally valuable skill to develop. And lastly, when he says, which is capable of producing persuasion, he is really identifying the specific object of rhetorical perception, not truth itself, but what has the power to convince or persuade other human beings. That's the real goal and focus of rhetoric. So there we have the definition. And I took some extra time to really get into that because that line where Aristotle defines rhetoric is obviously most important. Let's keep going. Aristotle writes, "For this is the employment of no other art, since each of the other arts is doctrinal and persuasive about that which is the subject of its consideration." Other arts, other studies are special. They're specialized or specific. Rhetoric is different from the other arts because while other arts teach and persuade about their own subject matter, rhetoric has the ability to find persuasive means on any topic, on any subject. Medicine teaches in a persuasive way about health. Geometry teaches in its own persuasive way about mathematical relationships. But rhetoric is different because it can address any subject that requires persuasion. Rhetoric can help the physician to speak persuasively about medicine and can help the geometrician to speak persuasively about geometry, or a business owner to speak persuasively of his business, a father to speak persuasively of morals with his children, and so on. Rhetoric applies to any subject, and that's what is uniquely valuable with rhetoric and why it has its place in the 7 liberal arts. He goes on to say, he talks also about arithmetic, goes more into the examples of how different arts speak about things, but rhetoric appears to be able to survey about any given thing what is adapted to produce persuasion. Hence also we say that it does not possess an artificial power about any certain peculiar, definite genus. So rhetoric is a universal art. That's what makes it so significant. It doesn't have its own subject matter like another science, but applies to all sciences, all topics, all issues. So we could say, well, it's not very scientific then. It's just sort of general knowledge. But Aristotle is explaining that this is its unique specialty. Its universality is what makes it most valuable. It's a strange argument to make, but that's what Aristotle is arguing. Just because it's general doesn't mean that it's not in a way scientific. It actually is the science or art of finding means of persuasion in any subject. That's the greatness of this art. He says, with respect to things which procure credibility, some of them are without art and others are artificial. We talked about the word artificial in chapter 1, not meaning fake, but meaning able to be performed by human skill. He turns, in this section here, he turns to look at the different sources of persuasion. And he divides them into two categories. He says some are without art and others are artificial or with art. So we've got two different kinds, two different sources of persuasion. The first kind, non-artificial, are proofs that don't come from the skill of the speaker. And he gives some examples, which we'll look at in a minute. So the non-artificial proofs, we don't really study to learn how to use them because they sort of provide their own persuasiveness. But we're primarily concerned about the artificial proofs, which require the work of one who is trained in the rhetorical art. He says, I call those without art, which are not devised by us, but which exist prior to all artificial invention, such as, and he gives us a list of examples here which makes what he's saying clear. Witnesses. If we have people who witness an event and we bring them into court and they simply tell what they saw and it proves our point, that's not persuasiveness in any artificial way. That's just simple evidence. So witnesses are an example of persuasiveness or credibility that does not come from art. Questions, just asking questions about what happened, what was seen, what was done, and so on. Writings, written evidence that supports or opposes an argument, and other particulars of the like kind. So evidence that already exists. The testimony of witnesses, documents, confessions, anything that was collected through questioning, and so on. The speaker has to know how to use these, but he's not the source of them. They're not the work of his art. He simply employs them if and when they're available. But he goes on to this second kind and says, those are artificial, which are capable of being procured methodically by us, so that it is requisite to use the former, that is the sources of proof that do not come from art, and to discover the latter. So we've got to discover these artificial proofs. And again, just a good example to illustrate this is the example of Sherlock Holmes, just coming up with these arguments. Watson is always amazed at Sherlock Holmes' ability, and he says, elementary, my dear Watson, it's just deductive reasoning. That's the idea. I'm able to discover, he says, the available means of persuasion on any of these different subjects. So we see, again, in Sherlock Holmes, a good, easy to remember, easy to understand illustration of this source of proof that comes from human art, which comes from us. Artificial proofs, those which the speaker generates through his own rhetorical skill, the skill that we're going to be working to develop as we study rhetoric. These kinds of proofs, these artificial proofs, require genuine art that comes through study and practice because they have to be procured by the speaker. They have to be created or discovered. And these principles of rhetoric are going to help us to do that. The speaker must use evidence which is available, but he must discover new sources of evidence. I should say new proofs which he himself invents, lines of argument which he himself comes up with that can prove the case or destroy the case that he's opposing. So understand the two different kinds of sources of credibility or proof. He says, of the credibility, however, which is procured by argument, there are three different species. These are called the modes of persuasion. Very important. So the kind of proof that actually comes from arguments made by the speaker, this artificial proof, there are three different kinds. One kind, he says, consists in the manners of the speaker, another in the disposition of the hearer, and the third in the argument itself. in consequence of demonstrating or appearing to demonstrate. So the three modes of persuasion, the Greek words are commonly used to refer to these. We have ethos, which refers to the emotion of the hearer. Ethos refers to the manners or the character of the speaker, ethos. Pathos refers to the emotions or the passions of the audience, the hearers. And logos refers to the logic or the argument itself. So ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, the character; pathos, the emotions of the hearer; and logos, the argument itself. So make sure you know those three modes or sources or ways of persuasion. It's helpful to remember the Greek names and understand what each of them pertains to. So in a situation where we're seeking to be persuasive or find available means of persuasion, we have these three sources. We can look at the effect of our own character, our own credibility. We can look at the emotional state of the hearers, the audience. And we can look, most importantly, as Aristotle would say, at the quality, the persuasiveness of our argument itself. So these are the three modes of persuasion, and it's important for us to understand that they always work together. They always work together in persuasion. So the ideal rhetorician would be a master of all three of these. The ideal rhetorician would be a master of all three of these. His own manners, his own reputation, his own character would be held as credible by his audiences. His own character, his ethos. He would understand human emotions. He would be very sensitive to the different circumstances and different emotional conditions of his hearers, and would carefully present everything to them in a way that was in harmony or effective, persuasive with respect to their current emotional condition. And then thirdly, the ability to develop clear and persuasive logical arguments. All three of these are needed for one to master this art of rhetoric, a very important lesson: ethos, pathos, and logos. He goes on to discuss these, and we'll go through his explanation of them. He says, credibility is procured through manners when the oration is delivered in such a way as to render the speaker worthy of belief. So we can gain credibility by the way that we speak. Ethos operates by making the speaker appear trustworthy, knowledgeable, virtuous, and so on, worthy of trust. It can also have the opposite effect. The way that a person speaks or the way a person presents himself could cause the audience to not trust the person. And you can think of lots of ways that this could happen. For example, being a student who has bad handwriting. Your teacher or someone that doesn't know you can look at your writing and say, this doesn't seem to be a very serious student. Look how careless his handwriting is. Look how sloppy this is. Someone who is caught in a lie instantly loses their credibility. Someone who talks about a subject they really don't understand. Those who do understand it can see that this speaker is not credible. They're willing to talk about something that they don't understand. So the way that we speak can cause us to become more credible or less credible. Aristotle goes on to say, for about everything, in short, we believe the worthy, that is, a man who is worthy, who has worthy manners, a well-mannered man. We believe the worthy in a greater degree, and we believe them more rapidly. But in those particulars in which an accurate knowledge cannot be obtained, there's no way for us to know, things which are ambiguous or unclear, we confide. We trust in the decisions of worthy men. That's how significant ethos is. This is a fundamental fact, we could say, about human psychology. We trust those who appear to be virtuous and competent, especially when we have no way of knowing what's actually true. We simply trust. This trust is important when we're dealing with matters or concerns that are uncertain, complex matters. Sometimes people aren't even willing to listen to all the arguments. They just trust a certain person and side with their decision making. We see this is the whole point of advertising, where we've got celebrities and experts brought in. People that the audience trusts are brought in to recommend a certain product or service because the makers of the commercials or the ads know that many people will just follow a person that they trust. This all has to do with ethos in rhetoric. Moving on, Aristotle says it is, however, requisite that this should happen through the oration, through the speech itself, and not entirely from a previous opinion respecting the speaker. We can gain credibility. We can establish ethos by the speech itself. What would happen if we had to talk to an audience who for some reason didn't like us? Is it possible to gain their respect and trust by the speech itself? Aristotle says yes. We can improve, we can gain, I should say, credibility from an audience by speaking effectively, by speaking according to the art of rhetoric. So there is a rhetorical ethos, an ethos that can be established by the speech itself and not merely from one's reputation. And that goes in both ways. One can have a bad reputation but make a great speech. One can also have a great reputation and make a bad speech. So the speech itself becomes a source of ethos or ethical persuasiveness. Aristotle says we must not admit what some teachers of rhetoric have asserted in their art, that the probity or honesty of the speaker contributes nothing to persuasion. And realize if we've got men who are sophists, it's important for them to believe and persuade others that a person's own trustworthiness doesn't matter, right? Doesn't have any influence on persuasiveness. That's clearly not true. Aristotle says, since nearly, as I may say, manners possess the most powerful and principal credibility, he criticizes anyone who suggests that ethos should be ignored. He argues instead that character-based persuasion is actually the most powerful form of persuasion. And this idea that we read in Aristotle is confirmed by St. Thomas, who teaches that virtue and truth naturally support each other. We trust good people. Anyone who says otherwise is just crazy. Credibility, Aristotle goes on now to the second mode, pathos. He says credibility is procured through the hearers when their passions, their emotions, are influenced by the oration, by the speech. We do not similarly form a judgment, Aristotle says, when we grieve, or when we rejoice, when we love, or when we hate. So the different passions in the soul, the different emotional conditions of the audience have an effect on their ability to be persuaded, and a master of the art of rhetoric will take that into consideration and speak appropriately to the emotional or to the emotional conditions or the passions of the audience. We don't judge in the same way when we're grieving or sad as we do when we're joyful. Pathos, this idea of the emotions or the passions. Pathos works by putting the audience into the right emotional state that will best prepare them to accept the speaker's message, trying to get them into the right state of mind or the right emotional state to receive the message. A good example of this, if you've ever watched Archbishop Fulton Sheen teach, He always starts his shows or his talks with jokes. He'll always start with a couple, funny, silly jokes, just silly um, jokes that get people laughing, that show him to be a humorous, friendly person. And you can see him as a master of rhetoric himself, just getting his audience into a friendly, happy, smiley, emotional state, which prepares them to receive the theological and moral message that he's about to deliver. He's a good example of this excellent focus on pathos in speaking and persuasion. So the danger with pathos is we often think about emotional manipulation. That's not what this is about. We're seeking to put the audience into an emotional state that is best for them to be able to reason, to be able to think clearly, to not be prejudiced, to not be affected by emotions that would lead them into error. Aristotle is recognizing and teaching that our emotions affect our judgment. Our emotions affect our judgment. And so a good speaker is helping his audience to make good judgments by helping to get their emotions into order. That's the good way to think about it. Working to help order their emotions so that they can think clearly. And it's not just making them happy, right? Not just being joking around. I mean, realize there's another time where it's good to be sad, or it's good to be angry, or it's good to be sober. It's not appropriate to joke around. So it's considering all the different passions and trying to get the audience into an emotional state that's best for them to judge justly. So he speaks about ethos. He then goes on to speak about pathos, credibility produced through the hearers. He says, to which species of credibility we assert that those who now deliver the art of rhetoric direct their attention. He says, too much attention has been given almost exclusively to the effects of character and emotions, ethos and pathos. And he wants to direct attention primarily to logos, or the power of arguments. He says, belief is produced through arguments. When we show what is true, or what appears to be true, from probabilities pertaining to several objects of inquiry. Remember in chapter 1, we said that philosophy is argued from absolutely certain first premises. But rhetorical arguments and discussions often don't begin with absolute truth. They begin with things that are either believed to be true or which are probably true. And that's why you see him referring to probability here. Belief is produced through arguments when we show what is true, or what appears to be true, from the probabilities pertaining to several objects of inquiry. Logos, or reasoning, operates through rational demonstration or proof, either by proving something to be true or by showing that it's probable based on accepted premises. So we don't have to prove that something is absolutely true. Sometimes we just have to lead an audience to see that it's most likely true. It's probable. That may be sufficient proof. And that's often, very often, the kind of proof that we're dealing with in rhetoric, because we're dealing with issues that really are not being argued from absolute truths like axioms or definitions and things like that. So we have to learn to work with probabilities. Logos, as I said, operates through demonstration, through proof, by proving that something is in fact true, or by showing that it's probable, based on some premise that the audience is willing to accept. And so we see here a connection between rhetoric and logic or dialectic, we realize that rhetoric and dialectic are related to one another, but rhetorical reasoning, as I said, deals with probabilities, whereas logic often deals with absolute truths or starts from absolute truth. So there's a need to give attention to probability in focusing on developing persuasive arguments, regardless of the character of the speaker or the emotional state of the audience, just pure reason alone. But remember, some people will say, like, I don't care what the audience thinks, or I don't care what I look like, or I don't care about my all that matters is that I tell the truth, that I give good. You can see clearly that Aristotle does not support that idea. Logos is important, and we can say the most effective, most important mode of persuasion, but all three modes of persuasion must be given attention by anyone who claims to be a rhetorician. The complete rhetorician must master all three areas of knowledge: logic, which is how we learn to construct arguments; ethics, which is where we learn to understand human character, virtue, and vice, and so on. That's why the study of ethics is so important. And psychology, the study of the soul. Don't get that confused necessarily with modern psychology. Aristotle has a treatise titled On the Soul. The study or the science of the soul is what we mean by psychology. So we see that these three studies are going to become very significant if we want to become effective speakers or effective communicators. Again, logic, the study of the art of reasoning, so that we can construct persuasive arguments. We know how to do that. Ethics, to study and understand human character, virtue and vice, and so on. And psychology, the study of the soul. Rhetoric is going to demand that we gain mastery in these three important branches of philosophy. And as I said, all of these are available in the works of Aristotle, which is one of the reasons why Aristotle is called the philosopher. Moving on, Aristotle says it happens that rhetoric is, as it were, something which grows upon dialectic and the discussion concerning manners, and it is just to call it political. Rhetoric builds on, grows upon dialectic. And again, if you're confused about this word dialectic, it's short for dialectical reasoning. And if you want to know, well, where do we learn that? We learn that in Aristotle's Topics. Rhetoric builds on dialectical reasoning, reasoning from premises that are not absolutely true, but only probable. Rhetoric also builds on ethics, the study of manners, of human character and virtue. And Aristotle here calls rhetoric political. It's political because it deals with community life. It deals with human happiness, not the happiness of one individual, but the happiness of all people. That's Aristotle's idea of the political science, the science of seeking the happiness of everyone, the common good, and so on. So rhetoric for Aristotle is a political science because it seeks to communicate effectively with the community, to promote the common good, a necessary art for that political science, which he says is the science which most directly serves the chief end of human life, which is true happiness. He goes on to say, rhetoric assumes the form of the political science, and those who profess it do so partly through ignorance, partly from arrogance, and partly from other human causes. Rhetoric assumes the form of political science, and those who profess it do so partly from ignorance, partly from arrogance, and partly from other human causes. So rhetoric naturally takes on the character of political science because both rhetoric and political science deal with practical reasoning about human life. But many, and again, this is a common theme as Aristotle gets started here with his work on rhetoric, many, he says, who claim to teach rhetoric do so poorly. They do so through ignorance, either because they don't understand the topic itself, that they just are truly ignorant, or because they are arrogant or proud, or they may have other either dishonest intentions, false motives, or whatever. But he says many claim to teach rhetoric but do so inadequately, some through ignorance, some from arrogance, and others from other human causes. So he's always trying to separate rhetoric from this false idea of rhetoric that was commonly held in his day, because he's trying to motivate people to take up this study. He says that rhetoric is a certain particle or part and resemblance of dialectic, as we observed in the beginning of this treatise. He's referring back to chapter 1. Again, dialectic or reasoning was respected by wise men. Rhetoric was despised by wise men because it was associated with the sophists, the deceivers. Aristotle has to say, look, that judgment of rhetoric is not true. They misuse it. They give it a bad name, but rhetoric actually is a necessary part of our pursuit and defense of the truth and of justice. And we've got to take it from them. We've got to claim it for ourselves and arrange it so that it accomplishes its true purpose. He says, if you value dialectic, then you must also value rhetoric. Rhetoric has its own distinctive characteristics and purposes that distinguish it from dialectic, and it's equally important. You must pursue both of these. If you accept one, you must accept the other. He says neither of them is a science of any definite thing, which shows how a thing subsists. But these, both rhetoric and dialectic, are powers of procuring arguments. They're extremely valuable. Rhetoric and dialectic are formal arts. They provide methods for reasoning rather than knowledge about specific subjects like the different philosophical sciences. They're powers, as we said before, or capacities that we need to apply across all different areas of knowledge. So he just continues to make his case for the value and importance of rhetoric, that it's as important as dialectic, which was the foundation of his whole philosophy. With respect to proof, either real or apparent, in the same manner as in dialectic, one kind is induction, another is a true syllogism. So here we're talking about different kinds of arguments: induction and what he refers to as a true syllogism, and a third, an apparent syllogism. So three kinds of proofs or arguments: induction, a true syllogism, and an apparent syllogism. This is true in dialectic. We have these three different kinds of arguments, and he says the same is also true in rhetoric. These two sciences are like mirror images of each other. They both share similar or the same properties in different ways. Just as we see that there are three different kinds of argument in dialectic, the same is true in rhetoric. He explains here there is a logical structure that underlies rhetorical arguments. Remember, he's arguing that it's not just luck or talent, or it's not all deception that causes persuasion, but real logical truth. And he's trying to show how this logical system works in rhetoric by comparing it with dialectic. He says dialectic uses induction, which is reasoning from um, individual things up to general principles. That's one kind of argument. Valid syllogisms and apparent syllogisms. And he says rhetoric has corresponding forms of reasoning, just like dialectic. He says example is induction. So just as there is induction in dialectic, in rhetoric we have example. So an example is a rhetorical induction. Just as we have the syllogism, the valid syllogism in dialectic, we have the enthymeme in rhetoric. He says, but I call enthymeme a rhetorical syllogism, and example I call a rhetorical induction. So it works just like dialectic. It's just as objective and true and real as the art of dialectic. There is an art to persuasiveness. The enthymeme, as I mentioned earlier, is rhetoric's version of a syllogism. It's a logical argument that's adapted for the purpose of persuasion. That's what an enthymeme is. The example, the use of examples, is rhetoric's version of inductive reasoning, reasoning from particular cases to general conclusions. If I tell a story about a certain man, the reason why I'm telling that story is because I want you to think about this particular instance and use it to actually influence a decision on another in another situation. And so you see what we're doing is we're using a particular example to draw a general or a universal conclusion that applies in other situations. That's what inductive reasoning does in dialectic. So the example is a rhetorical induction. This is a very simple concept that he's explaining here, but when you read through this the first time, having these vocabulary items thrown at you all at once, enthymeme, syllogism, induction, example, and so on, it can be confusing, but it's really very simple. And you should diagram it out to make it clear. On one side, write dialectic and list the three different kinds of persuasion: induction, valid syllogism, and apparent syllogism. And then on the other side, write rhetoric and the corresponding. Just as there is induction in dialectic, so there is example in rhetoric. Just as there is valid syllogism in dialectic, there is enthymeme in rhetoric. I hope I said that right, dialectic and rhetoric. So realize it's a simple concept he's communicating because he's just making this comparison. But because there's a bunch of new vocabulary in the section, I think that causes students to be intimidated a little bit and think that this is actually more confusing than it really is. He goes on to say, all rhetoricians who procure belief by the proofs which they adduce, and the word adduce just comes from the Latin to lead forward or bring forward. All rhetoricians who procure belief by the proofs that they bring forward effect it, that is, they accomplish it, either by the examples that they bring or by enthymemes. And in a certain respect, there's nothing else besides these. So he's saying there is a method to this. All rhetoricians who are persuasive use proofs that are just one of two different kinds. It's either an example or it's an enthymeme. Either it's a kind of induction or it's a kind of syllogism. All logical persuasion reduces to these two forms. It's this simple. We either reason from examples or we reason through enthymemes, either induction or deduction. And so this very simple division here of these two different kinds of reasoning, I mean, think of how simple this is. Aristotle is saying the key to developing persuasiveness really requires nothing more than a mastery of the use of examples and enthymemes, of inductive and deductive arguments. It's really that simple. And so, like I said, this provides a systematic foundation, which is the whole goal that Aristotle has here in Rhetoric, a systematic framework or foundation for analyzing and constructing all arguments. What we're paying attention to as we listen to other people speak, what we're thinking about as we work to develop our own speeches or writings. It's actually very simple and methodical. He goes on to say what the difference is between example and enthymeme is evident from the topics where we study dialectical reasoning more fully. For there, syllogism and induction are previously discussed. Now, one important note here, notice that Aristotle himself gives us some direction as to the order in which his works are to be studied. He's arguing that the topics ought to be studied before rhetoric. And it's obvious because he said that rhetoric is counterpart to dialectic, and dialectic is studied in the topic. So take that as a note. If you really want to build a strong foundation in the art of rhetoric, you can move along studying rhetoric by itself, but what Aristotle would actually advise is that you either study these two works together or you study the topics first. So that's a helpful insight into the method for studying, or the order of the curriculum that comes from Aristotle himself, a little nugget of educational advice, as it were. So Aristotle there refers to his own work on dialectical reasoning in the topics, where he explains the logical principles that he's now arguing underlie rhetorical arguments. And he's showing here the connection between dialectic and his own teaching on dialectic, which appears to have already been received, and this art on rhetoric, which he's now presenting to his audience. He says, if it is shown in many and similar things that what we assert is true, there indeed it is induction, but here it is example. When, however, certain things existing, something else besides these happens from these, because these subsist either universally or for the most part. That means often, not necessarily universally, not always, but most of the time. When this is the case, there in dialectic, it is called syllogism, but here it's called enthymeme. So there he gives a really clear explanation of how these different kinds of argument work in logic and rhetoric. He really explains the nature of them. All right? If it is shown in many and similar things, that is, examples, what we assert is true, there in dialectic it's called induction. When we argue from example, from I shouldn't say examples, when we argue from individual things to general conclusions, in dialectic we call it induction. Here in rhetoric it's just example. And likewise, and he here defines syllogism, the language can be a little confusing. He says, when certain things existing, that is in premises, something else happens from these, that is a conclusion, because they subsist either universally or for the most part. If a conclusion follows necessarily from a set of premises, in dialectic we call that a syllogism. Well, in rhetoric, we call that an enthymeme. So he's just showing in more detail the truth of what he's explaining. He goes on to say, arguments, therefore, from examples are no less calculated to persuade than others, but those from enthymemes cause greater perturbation. Perturbation is a great word. Both forms of argument, he says, examples and syllogisms, or examples and enthymemes, both forms of argument can be equally persuasive, but enthymemes tend to have stronger impact, more emotional impact, greater perturbation. Just so we have an idea of this word perturbation, this word is the word that the Stoics used to talk about the mental frustration that we suffer from when we allow our desires to be set on things that are not in our control, that mental vexation, that is perturbation. He says, if you can prove something by means of an enthymeme, by means of a syllogistic argument, your opponent will be more upset, more shaken by that kind of an argument because it starts from universal principles and reasons down to a specific instance than he would be if you try to persuade him with examples by naming one or more instances that illustrate a general principle and then trying to persuade him to accept that general principle. He's saying that's not going to be as effective as a deductive argument, as an enthymeme. He says, for that which is persuasive to someone, and one thing is immediately of itself persuasive and credible, but another because it appears to be proved through things that are credible. He explains here that persuasion is always relative to the audience. Some things are immediately credible to particular audiences. Others require demonstration through premises that the audience already accepts. And we can think of a million examples of this from the New Testament. The apostles would go into different towns, and the messages that they taught, the miracles that they did, would instantly persuade non-Jews, and tons of Gentiles were coming into the Christian church, but they weren't persuasive to the Jews. And so the apostles have to adjust their message depending on their audience, because things that move the Gentiles, the people outside Israel, have no effect on the Jews, and things that might move a Jew would have no impact on those who live outside of Israel. Arguments from the scriptures might be persuasive to Jews. They'd be meaningless to Gentiles who didn't even know about the scriptures. So Aristotle is explaining that the credibility of an argument is determined by the audience. It's something that's outside of the speaker, which again is important because that which is outside of our control is not our responsibility. We're responsible for that which is in our control, which is the ability to discern what can be or should be persuasive on any subject. He goes on to say, no art speculates that which is particular. Thus, for instance, medicine, he's talking about the audience here again. Medicine, the art of medicine, does not study or speculate what is salubrious or healthful to an individual person, but what is salubrious or healthful to such a one, to anyone. That's what that means, to anyone, or to such persons in general. So he's explaining that the arts are concerned with general applications, with universal applications. We don't study to learn what will persuade an individual person. We study the art which reveals to us and helps us to understand what is generally or universally, normally, ordinarily persuasive. We don't study medicine to know what is salubrious to Socrates, the individual, but what is salubrious to persons in general. This, he says, is artificial. True arts deal with universals, not particulars. Medicine, to understand what promotes health generally. not necessarily in individual cases. This universal knowledge, Aristotle's arguing, is what makes a genuine art or science. And this is what rhetoric does, he's saying. Rhetoric does not speculate of opinable particulars. Rhetoric does not speculate opinable particulars such as what is subject or what is the subject of opinion to Socrates or Hippias, that is, to individuals. But what is the subject of opinion to such and such persons, generally speaking, in the same way that dialectic does? So again, he's showing here another way in which rhetoric is like dialectic in its relation to its audience, that it's directed at a general audience, or what is held by most people, not necessarily by an individual. Rhetoric seeks to understand what kinds of arguments persuade certain types of audiences, not merely what happens to convince particular individuals. So we can think of a specific example of, let's say, a saint. Let's say Saint Bernadette has the exclusive privilege of seeing the Blessed Virgin Mary in an apparition. That really doesn't belong to the study of the art of rhetoric. We're not concerned about what persuaded this one individual, which may be an extraordinary private revelation. Rhetoric is concerned as a human art and science with what is generally persuasive to a group of people, a certain audience. The employment of rhetoric consists in such particulars as are the subject of our consultation, respecting which we have no art. So we see Aristotle begin to talk about consultation. Consultation refers to deliberation, decisions that we make, judgments that we deliberate on, we seek advice on. There are subjects which we don't consult on. We don't deliberate on what to do if our house is burning down. We don't deliberate or consult about what to do. We don't consult about things that are impossible. We don't deliberate on things that are beyond our control. We deliberate on things that are present and probable. So rhetoric consists in such particulars, such particular things or subjects as are the subject of our consultation, respecting which we have no other art. Rhetoric deals with practical matters where we have to make decisions without perfect knowledge. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what other people are going to do. We don't know how the weather is going to change. So there's all kinds of variables and uncertainties in practical matters, and rhetoric is the art of deliberating in such matters. Really profound if you think about it. Rhetoric deals with practical matters where we have to make decisions with imperfect knowledge, with partial information, and so on. These are areas where human deliberation is necessary because the outcome is not predetermined. We have to make deliberation. And what are we trying to do when we deliberate? We're not trying to figure out what is the quote unquote right answer. What we're really trying to decide is what's the best thing to do based on probabilities, not what is the right thing to do, but what's just the best thing to do. That's really the goal of deliberation or consultation. And you just see that we have to wonder, is there a way to make good decisions in practical matters when there's just so much uncertainty? The answer is yes. The art of rhetoric enables us to make good decisions and to not only receive consultation and deliberation, but to deliver consultation and help with deliberation. We consult, Aristotle says, about things, the subsistence of which appears to be possible in both ways. That is, things which may subsist otherwise than they do. These are called contingent matters, matters that are uncertain. We deliberate about contingent matters, things that could turn out differently depending on our choices and actions. Um, we may not know what's going to happen, but our decisions contribute to what actually does happen. We may not know what's going to happen, but what we do can influence the outcome. And we see that there's all these moving parts and it's very confusing. That's the purpose of deliberation, to try to figure out what we should do. What's the best thing to do? Knowing that our decision will also have an influence on the outcome. These are contingent matters, the kinds of matters that are appropriate for deliberation. We don't deliberate on mathematical truths. We don't deliberate on necessary things that take place in nature, because these are not things that are changed by any human decision. So Aristotle says it's necessary that enthymeme and example should be conversant with such things as, for the most part, admit of a various or changing subsistence. So, because again, we're talking about rhetoric, we're dealing with subjects that are uncertain. And we're going to take these concepts from dialectic, these concepts of syllogism and induction, and we're going to bring them into the art of rhetoric and apply them to these topics which are appropriate for deliberation, uncertain topics. Rhetorical arguments, as I've said, deal with probable truths rather than necessary truths, things that are likely to happen, not things that are necessarily known to be about to happen. We reason from premises that are usually true, not from absolute truths. So it's a different quality of science, but extremely important because that's the nature of practical affairs. He goes on to say that it's necessary that enthymeme and example should consist from a few things, and frequently from fewer than those from which the first syllogism consists. In other words, rhetorical arguments must be simpler than strict logical demonstrations, because the audiences in whom we're seeking to obtain persuasion, the audiences can't follow complex reasoning when we're talking about practical problems, practical contexts. The enthymeme often leaves some premises unstated and trusts that the audience is able to supply them. So there's also this challenge of the weakness of the human mind or attention span. It's one thing to be a philosopher, to be of extraordinary mental discipline and be able to trace out long and complex reasonings in philosophical sciences, but in matters of persuasion, in rhetorical contexts, we've got to consider the mental capacity of the audience, and we can't do in a rhetorical message or in a political speech what we could do in a philosophical investigation. So the quality of the arguments, the length and detail of the arguments needs to be adjusted appropriately. He goes on and says, for enthymemes are deduced from probabilities and signs, so that it's necessary that each of these should be the same with each. And this is a section of the text that I think is very difficult to read through for students. Enthymemes are deduced from probabilities and signs, so that it's necessary that each of these should be the same with each. What he's saying is that enthymemes work with probable premises and signs. Signs are indicators. I mean, just think of the word sign. It's a thing that points to something else. A sign indicates or suggests conclusions without proving them in a definitive way. A sign, um, I guess the best word I can think of is a suggestion or an indication, um, uh, something that points to a conclusion but doesn't necessarily prove it. And you can see how that relates to probability. Not absolute certainty, not absolute demonstrative truth, but um, sufficient credibility in a rhetorical situation. Pro- uh, Probable premises and signs. Keep those two things in mind. And because enthymemes, rhetorical syllogisms, work with probable premises and with signs, both of which are imperfect, we see that the nature of practical reasoning forces us to act with incomplete information. That's just the nature of deliberation or consultation on practical matters. Aristotle says the probable is that which subsists, that which is true for the most part, usually, but not simply, not in an absolute sense, according to the definition of some persons. Probability means what usually happens, what we should expect, what a reasonable person would expect to happen. We should make decisions when we don't know exactly what's going to happen. A wise man, a prudent man, makes a decision based on what usually happens. That's probability, not mere possibility. It's not the same thing as what's possible, but what's probable, what's likely to happen. And realize that in many cases, what's decided on in a rhetorical dilemma, we may be wrong. The outcome may not be what we desired, but we can still be credited with having made the right decision based on what usually happens. So, for example, if we're told that a hurricane is scheduled to hit the area where we live, we can think about what usually happens in the case of a hurricane, and we should make decisions that are true based on what usually happens. That would be prudent. And so if we do what would be done if what usually happens, that's good preparation. If the storm turns out to be weaker than we were told it might be, and we went overboard with our preparations and boarded up our houses and moved all our stuff, we can't say that we made a bad decision. We made the right decision. We made the best decision based on what usually happens. And on the other hand, if something worse happens and it turns out the storm is much stronger than we anticipated, even though the outcome is not what we desired, what we were trying to avoid, we can still be credited with having done what was best, given the information we had, and making decisions based on what usually happens. So you can see that's just the nature of rhetorical problems. With respect to signs, one has such a subsistence as some one of particulars to that which is universal. And again, this is logical language, so it's a little difficult to follow unless you're familiar with these terms from the study of logic. With respect to signs, we talked about these being suggestions of conclusions, but not proofs. One has such a subsistence as some one of particular things to that which is universal, but another as some one of universal things to that which is particular. Now, one good thing about Aristotle's teaching is he often presents a sentence like this that's difficult or almost impossible to understand. But what he does is he follows these kinds of statements that he makes with examples, and the examples often or usually clarify what exactly he's teaching. So let's read this sentence again, and then as we go down, we'll see examples that clarify this. So don't get discouraged when you read and can't understand, realize that there's more to follow. And Aristotle's a master teacher. He's not going to leave you confused without sufficient explanation. With respect to signs, one has a subsistence as some one of particulars to that which is universal. Another has a subsistence as sum of universals to that which is particular. He distinguishes here between different types of signs based on the relationship that they have to what they signify. And realize signify is simply the verb that refers to what signs do. They make a sign, they point to something. Some signs, just to make this easy to understand, some signs move from particular evidence to universal conclusions. Other signs move from universal principles to particular applications. Remember, they suggest a conclusion. They don't necessarily prove the conclusion to be true. Aristotle says, of these signs, that indeed which is necessary is an argument, but that which is not necessary is anonymous according to difference. Again, more confusing language. That which is necessary is an argument. That which is not necessary is anonymous, meaning it has no name, according to difference. Necessary signs provide conclusive evidence. Aristotle mentions the Greek name for such signs. He says tekmeria, which are actually proofs. Necessary signs. The sign suggests something that necessarily happens. But that which is not necessary, he says, is anonymous according to difference. Non-necessary signs simply provide an indication of what is probable. Non-necessary signs do not provide proof. They're not really an argument. They provide an indication of what is probable. And this distinction that Aristotle makes is important for evaluating the strength of rhetorical arguments. We've got to be able to discern between signs whether one is necessary or one is not necessary. Often we'll be presented with a message from someone trying to persuade us to do something, and they will use signs, and it will be misleading because we won't carefully examine whether the signs are necessary or not necessary, whether they are actually a good argument of what is going to happen or should be done, and or whether they're simply an indication of what is probably going to happen or what, based on what's probable, should be done. So that ability to discern and to catch those kinds of arguments is something that we're going to cultivate through this study of the art of rhetoric. And he gives us an example to bring this chapter to a close. He says, for example, and as I said before, anytime you're reading Aristotle and you feel like it's getting very difficult, very confusing, just keep reading, because he'll usually provide examples that make everything crystal clear. And that's what he does here. He says, thus, for instance, talking about all this signs and necessary signs and not necessary signs, what in the world is he talking about? Well, let's wait for his example. He says, for instance, Dionysius endeavored to establish a tyrannical government. So here's an example of an individual, an example. Dionysius, an individual, endeavored to establish a tyrannical government. And to do this, he sought a guard. He wanted to have defense or protection. That's an example of a ruler seeking to surround himself with protection because he is about to establish a tyrannical government. So it's an example where that happens, where the preparation of the guard was a sign that came before and pointed to his intention to establish a tyrannical government. Now, let's take another character, Pisistratus. He did the same thing. He demanded a guard, and having obtained it, tyrannized over the Athenians. So we have an example of this being done. Aristotle is showing us with this example how this rhetorical reasoning works in practice. Was it absolutely certain that Dionysius was going to establish a tyrannical government? No, but there was a precedent, there was an example where someone had done this. And so the ordering of a guard was a sign of an intention to establish a tyrannical government. Was it proof? No. But the prudent see evil coming and avoid it. And knowing of the deeds of Pisistratus, men could see the actions of Dionysius and say, hey, look what he's doing. He's ordering a guard for himself. That's what Pisistratus did to prepare to seize power. I think it's probable that Dionysius is going to attempt to seize power. The only evidence that I have is that he did the same thing Pisistratus did. So it's an example of how, in a rhetorical situation where the truth is unknown, exactly what's going to happen is unknown, an individual example can be used as a sign to make a decision based on what may happen, to make the best possible decision. So the pattern that's observed in previous cases provides probable cause or probable grounds for suspecting that there may be similar intentions in this present case, even though the conclusion is not certain. And that is enough for wise men to make good decisions. So that brings us to the end of this long lesson, and I apologize for the length, but I wanted to make sure we addressed every bit of content in the chapter. What I'd like to do is leave you with 10 points of memory work that sum up what we've covered. You could jot these down, hit pause to listen to them, but I'm going to go through them quickly to bring this lecture to an end. Memory work point number 1. Rhetoric is the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion. The definition that Aristotle gives us. Rhetoric is the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion. Number 2, rhetoric differs from other arts because it can address any subject matter rather than having its own specific domain. Rhetoric differs from other arts because it can address any subject matter rather than having its own specific domain. Number 3, there are 2 kinds of proofs: non-artificial proofs that already exist and artificial proofs that the speaker creates. There are 2 kinds of proofs: non-artificial proofs that already exist and artificial proofs that the speaker creates. Number 4, there are 3 modes of persuasion: ethos, the speaker's character; pathos, the audience's emotion; and logos, the logical argument. The 3 modes of persuasion are ethos, the speaker's character; pathos, the audience's emotion; and logos, the logical argument. Number 5, ethos provides the most powerful form of credibility when properly established through the speech itself. Ethos provides the most powerful form of credibility, rhetorically speaking, when properly established through the speech itself. Number 6, rhetoric grows upon dialectic and ethics and deserves to be called political science. Rhetoric grows upon dialectic and ethics and deserves to be called political science. Number 7, the two forms of rhetorical argument are enthymeme, which is a rhetorical syllogism, and example, which is a rhetorical induction. The two forms of rhetorical argument are enthymeme, rhetorical syllogism, and example, rhetorical induction. Enthymemes work from probable premises and deal with contingent matters that could be otherwise. Enthymemes work from probable premises and deal with contingent matters that could be otherwise. Number 10, rhetorical arguments must be simpler than strict logical proofs to be effective with audiences. Rhetorical arguments must be simpler than strict logical proofs to be effective with audiences. And lastly, number 10, signs provide evidence for conclusions, with necessary signs being conclusive and non-necessary signs being merely probable. Signs provide evidence for conclusions, with necessary signs being conclusive and non-necessary signs being merely probable. So in this lecture, we've studied chapter 2 of book 1 of Aristotle's Rhetoric. And as I said, it's a very difficult chapter. We've discussed the definition of rhetoric as the power of perceiving what produces persuasion. We've looked at the three modes of persuasion: ethos, pathos, and logos. We've looked at the relationship between rhetoric and dialectic, and the nature of enthymemes and examples as forms of argument in rhetoric. Now, it's time for you, the student, to reread and study the lesson for yourself. Develop your understanding of the lesson by careful study, by taking notes, and by working to complete the graded assessments that are available in the course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you have any questions about the lesson, if there's anything else you'd like to ask about, if there's anything that was discussed that you feel wasn't clear or needs to be clarified, please visit the Academy Help Center at classicalliberalarts.com/support and ask away. We're here to help. Once again, my name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I hope that this lesson has been helpful for a very difficult study. God bless your studies.